offer a warm welcome to our speaker today, who is Dr. Tom Harrison, the Director of Education at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues and Programme Director for the MA in Character Education. His specialist interests are character, cyber wisdom and the internet, character education and virtue ethics, and he's recently published a book called Thrive: How to Cultivate Character So Your Children Can Flourish Online, which was published in January this year. Tom, over to you, and thank you for giving us your time this evening.
Thank you very much indeed, Fiona. And just before we get started, can I just check, because I think, Luana, I'm currently seeing the screen, not the slide. Yeah, okay, that's great. Just so I can see the slide. Just I think it was slightly off-putting to be seeing a big picture of myself coming back at myself again. But then again, I suppose in these uncertain times, everything seems a little strange these days. I'm desperately hoping that my internet holds up, and I'm looking for your kind of faces to see whether it is right now, because just in the pre-meeting I was losing the internet a couple of times, and I've just sent in again kind of the very modern feature of just texting my whole family to tell them to stop using the internet various places around the house right now. So I'm definitely going to be in the bad books when I stop doing this presentation, as they have been instructed to go and do something other than using the internet in various different places. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. Thank you so much for coming along to listen to my presentation, and I'd like to think it's because of the quality of the presentation, but I'm also aware that there is not so much else to do in these times right now. So, but hopefully what I'm able to provide in terms of the content today will do this very impressive seminar series on education purpose and human flourishing in an uncertain time. This seminar series, hopefully it will do it justice and fit nicely with the seminars that have gone previous to this. Just to briefly say thank you again, Fiona, very much for the introduction, and just to briefly say a little bit more about kind of my background, my contacts, and there's a lot of you I recognise as the names have been flagging up, so I won't spend too much time on this because I know a lot of you I've met and worked with previously, but just to underline slightly, I suppose, where my hopefully expertise to give this seminar comes from. I've worked within the Jubilee Centre at the University of Birmingham, the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, for over well, nearly 10 years now. We've got our 10-year anniversary next year at the centre. I was Director of Education from the outset when we set up in the centre 10 years ago, and I've fulfilled that role ever since. And really that's what I'm hoping to really give it a view to you today, is I'm not going to do the kind of the standard Jubilee Centre stuff, talking through kind of what is character education, and the kind of different typology of virtues and all that sort of stuff, which you could find in our framework, and I know that we quite often talk about in different sorts of presentations anyway. What I thought I'd do today was try to give you an insight from the kind of the teachers and the practitioners that I work with around character and character education, and try to kind of, I suppose, I work in my role as Director of Education very much on that kind of theory practice nexus, and I want to try and show you kind of how some of the kind of the theoretical approaches to character and human flourishing that have been undertaken in various research projects at the centre are viewed and considered by school practitioners and teachers, and show how they kind of might be understood as contributing to human flourishing from that school-based perspective. And then I'm going to speak for about half an hour or so from now, and then my last couple of slides actually raise some of the I think are some of the most critical points and questions if we think that character and character education can contribute to human flourishing. And I'm talking in particular kind of character education as delivered in a school-based context. If we think that can deliver or contribute to character education, then I'm going to talk through some of what I think are the key challenges and issues, and hopefully that will lead very nicely into kind of a discussion and debate around some of the topics that I've actually been kind of presenting today. So that is actually my intention. If we could move to the next slide, that'd be great. Excellent. I've spoken broadly about this, but for those who don't know about the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, please do look at the website, jubileecentre.ac.uk. You'll find a huge range of different materials from the research projects that we undertake with professionals, teachers, doctors, lawyers, nurses. We're currently doing projects with the police. We've done projects with the army, etc., etc. A lot of the work we've done in the voluntary sector, looking at kind of character and flourishing from a from a community stance, to the work and a lot of the work that we've done in character education in more formal educational settings like schools, and in more latterly higher education. Alongside the Oxford Character Project, we published a statement on character in higher education recently, and we're looking at what character in kind of colleges and the higher education sector looks like, and then certainly my own work has been more closely related to character and kind of families and parenting. The book that Fiona mentioned, here's the shameless plug of the Thrive book that I published with Little Brown Publishers a month ago ago. That book's largely for parents, and it takes a very kind of hopefully accessible approach to seeing why character is so important in the digital age, trying to reject things like rules-based approaches, or not reject, but suggest how rules or deontological-based approaches and more utilitarian-based approaches are not ideally suited to managing behaviour in the digital sphere, and why character, and in particular what I call cyber wisdom, is so important in that sort of area. But all of that sort of work, and there's a big project we're running on cyber phronesis, the cultivation of what we call cyber phronesis or cyber wisdom is undertaking within the project. The Jubilee Centre undertake that as well. So have a look through the website, see the range of different projects that we're working on right now. If we could move to the next slide, that would be great. I mean, a lot of you will probably well know this quote from Aristotle. I tend to use it in most of my presentations because I think it not only is a great way to remember why we might think about or consider character education an important aspect, but also you know, what is the outcome that we're actually looking from it. So it's great to teach about character, about virtue, but ultimately our aim is to you know, have a purpose that contributes or improves human flourishing through human goodness. But I think that's also a watchword for a lot of the work that I've been undertaking at the Jubilee Centre, as I say, which I'm going to give you a window into today, but also a lot of the work that the centre undertakes itself is trying to ensure that it's not just about conducting, hopefully, you know, kind of high level, valid and robust research and empirical projects. Clearly, those are very important. Also ensuring that we've got a very strong, largely philosophical, theoretical underpinning to our work, drawing on kind of other disciplines, etc., like psychology when necessary, and theology and sociology, etc., when necessary. But ultimately it's about the impact, if I can use that word, of this work, what actually happens when this kind of theory, this empirical studies kind of hits the ground, what actually changes and hopefully beneficial changes happen in schools as well. So, you know, that's a good watchword for, I think, our own work and my work from the centre is, and as I say, preludes his speech quite nicely, because it's not about what we know, but it's actually how is that knowing applied in schools and understood in schools, and in this particular context, but obviously generally anywhere. If we could move to the next slide. So this is actually a slide I quite often start with in school. I'm very lucky to be invited to give a lot of schools based presentations. Well, actually, I'm still invited to do them in these virtual settings, which is just not the same as actually kind of spending time with teachers. But certainly before the pandemic, I was really privileged to be invited into lots of schools and speak to lots of teachers. And indeed, in my own teacher training programs that we run at University of Birmingham, when I guest lecture in that, and in other universities as well, I quite often start by exploring almost in a dialogue way with the teachers, about what they think their purpose is. What is their, and I try not to get too existential about this in terms of kind of what they feel their purpose in life and in the world is, but what is their purpose? What is their professional purpose? What is their purpose as a teacher? What do they actually see that? And I think this hopefully starts some challenging and robust conversations. And I am in many ways trying to seek to provoke in that sort of area. But what I find is that so many teachers actually, when you start to get them to list or talk about their purpose, it's so much beyond what, if you just listen to a lot of our kind of Ofsted inspectors and certainly many of our ministers of education would perhaps define as the purpose of education. And it's very much mirrored in the conversations that I have with teachers. I remember very vividly speaking at a conference in Leeds about 2 years ago, big at one of the Catholic universities up in Leeds, and they had probably, I would say, maybe 500 kind of mainly senior leaders, head teachers, packed into an auditorium. I was privileged to give a keynote presentation there, and you give the presentation, and then at the end of it, you kind of slightly nervously wonder how that's gone down as you look across the sea of faces. And I just remember two kind of head teachers coming down the steps towards me and looking quite serious, and they were pretty big, pretty well built, and I was thinking, what are we going to get here? And they were looking quite stern, and then one of them just turned to me at the end, and he just said, "That was fantastic," and he said that was about the first time he'd had a presentation in 10 years since he'd been a head teacher that wasn't about how to pass Ofsted, which is our inspection regime, schools inspection body in the UK, or not about how to kind of get children through a particular tests or particular exams, etc. He said that was all they got whenever they went for kind of continued professional development. My presentation, which was about those broader aims of education, about the cultivation of character qualities, about human qualities that are going to contribute not only to individuals flourishing, but more broadly societal flourishing, was, and as I say, I was staggered to hear it was the first time that they'd actually been to that sort of presentation, and they said, and teachers repeatedly say that this is why they actually went into education. This was their purpose. This is what they function. But in many ways, we so much narrowed that. And I hear this time and time again when I actually speak to teachers within that area. So I think so many of the answers that I get about what is the purpose, even if teachers are very much talking about knowledge development, about attainment, etc., about employability, all these things are clearly very valid answers. Even those, a lot of them have an underpinning of character. Children, young people get jobs because of who they are, because of the character qualities, because of the wisdom that it can show in the workplace. The surveys show us that's what employers value, many of them more than kind of skills and expertise, knowledge in different areas. If we think, it's about kind of pure attainment and intellectual thought, a lot of that still comes from having children and young people who develop character qualities that made them kind of eager and keen learners, people who are able to learn alongside other people capable of independent thought, critical thinking, etc., etc. So character so much relates to so many of the other answers that I get around this question as well. And so the argument and my conviction about this is built up over time as I work for the centre, is that character has been a core and consistent theme throughout education, that is not something new kid on the block, and it's also not something going away, because most schools and most teachers I speak to see characters very much as the heart of what their purpose is. If we could just move to the next slide, that would be great. And I think one of the issues that we've faced, perhaps particularly within the last 20 years or so, but perhaps longer than that, and I'm primarily talking about again the UK kind of education system here, but I think the sorts of issues I'm going to talk about near are replicated in quite a lot of other countries as well, including the US. Is that the pendulum, if we and this is an oversimplification, but if we think that, you know, kind of character and attainment could be seen as either side of the of a pendulum, that the pendulum has swung quite much in favour of attainment, and what I say, preparing kind of young people for a life of tests rather than the tests of life. And there is a lot of questions. I think the fact that one of the driving force around this has been what Jerry Muller calls in a fantastic book, The Tyranny of Metrics. He does talk about education within that book, but he talks about the tyranny of metrics across the whole of society. And I want to read this because I think this is really fundamental to his argument and lots of the argument. So Jerry Muller in The Tyranny of Metrics says, "The path to succeed is quantifying human performance, publicising the results, and dividing up the rewards based on the numbers. We've gone from measuring performance to fixation on measurement itself. And this tyranny of metrics now threatens the quality of our organisations and our lives." And in many ways, the tyranny of metrics, which I think, you know, in a forgiving way, you'd think that has been brought in by education ministers and been very much implemented through Ofsted in many years, perhaps did have good aims to try and drive up standards, to try and drive up attainment, etc. But it's got to a point that is causing all sorts of kind of issues within the within the sector, including I think there's research that shows evidence linked to kind of teacher retention and well-being and all these other things through kind of an over focus on metrics. But in terms of what we're particularly concerned about here is that it's squeezed out a lot of that focus on character and character education and the education of kind of human qualities that contribute to flourishing. And we all know that PISA tables, whatever we think of them, only you can't tell or fully judge the education of a country through PISA tables. Likewise, league tables do not tell us about the quality of a school fully. And, you know, I would hate it if my children were being judged on their grades alone. If their attainment was the only thing that they were being judged on, I would find that very, very troubling. So we know that these grades, these metrics that have been brought into education are only part of the picture, and we need to bring back or rediscover the importance of character if we think that you know, if we understand the link between character and human flourishing, that I will come on to. So these are the sorts of things I hear from schools. If we can move on to the next slide, please. But I am very positive, and I do believe there is a kind of a new dawn and been a bit of a reawakening. I think there is a number of evidence that we can see around that, where we're moving to perhaps more qualifiable rather than quantifiable understanding about the purpose of education and flourishing in that area, where we're actually putting more focus on education in its transformative nature rather than its transactional effects that it can actually have on people. And, you know, I'm an optimist, and I just feel that there is some shifts that's been happening recently, perhaps even more notifiably within the recent period, but we can discuss that in the discussion at the end, whether you share my optimism in this space. But I think you know, we're a long way, I think, from where kind of character is given equal weight to attainment in schools. But there are some shifting sands. So promisingly, again, in the UK, in this country, Ofsted has included character as part of a separate personal development section of its kind of framework that it inspects schools. Previously, personal development was coupled with behaviour. Behaviour now has its own kind of pillar. There's 4 pillars, and personal development has its own pillar. Any common sense stands to reason that behaviour is important in schools, but it's a very short-term thing. We want our kids to behave in the class so that they can actually learn. actually personal development, or what we would call character, and character is actually named within the Ofsted framework, and it uses actually the Jubilee Centre's definition of character within the guidance for teachers within there. Character is much more about the long-term management of self, I suppose. It's not about teachers telling kids what to do and how to behave correctly in a particular classroom setting. Character, personal development is about who you are in the long term, and independently and autonomously, without sticks or carrots, without kind of consequences or kind of rules telling us how to particularly behave. And that's why character is so fundamentally important in the longer term, when when children don't have necessarily the same kind of behaviour measures. So that was a promising sign. Now I think most Ofsted still focuses on the kind of the attainment metrics, the first area, and probably behaviour over personal development. But those are signs that things are actually shifting. So I think we're beginning to really recognise this, and I think there's some drivers for this. My particular area, as I say, is mainly around digital technologies and looking at the digital sphere. And it's interesting how so many of the conversations around the kind of internet pioneers, if we want to call them, kind of the Zuckerbergs, the Google founders, etc., was actually quite altruistic to start with, and some may say character based. It was about kind of bringing people together and solving world problems, and kind of bringing compassionate communication. But as Ruha Fuhar in her book Don't Be Evil, and others have noticed that so many of these big tech companies have actually lost their soul over time, and there's been actually quite a backlash about social media and other areas recently, and a lot of that backlash is recognizing that governments are in no place to be able to control big tech, and as much as they want to through regulation. These arguments are going everywhere, and we need to return to values and virtues and maybe character-based approach, both through the designers of the technology, but also through the users of it as well. So I'm just giving kind of snippets of areas where I think there's some seeds that we're beginning to see kind of a real revigorated focus on character in the education and other spheres as well. And if we go to the next slide, I just picked these completely out, almost at random, but I just found it kind of fairly amusing that right now you can get an audio book of Nicomachean Ethics, which is the Aristotelian kind of founding book about kind of virtue ethics and character. Most of the kind of the founding philosophy that the Jubilee Centre and others have based their approach to character education on virtue ethics is in that Nicomachean Ethics. You can now find it as an audio book. You can listen to it as an audio book. For those who like football, you'll see that in the middle there is Jurgen Klopp, who not doing so well this year if you're a Liverpool fan, but last year Liverpool won the Premier League, and he talks about character all the time as being the difference between maybe different types of character than what the Jubilee Centre, but the rhetoric of character is very much in what he says. So most recently, not most recently, but here's a particular quote. He said, in the Premier League, tell me one player who is not skilled. So all the players, he's saying, in the Premier League are skilled. You mix that with the right character, and now we start talking about the right things. So he's talking about, skills, are necessary and important, but actually what marks you out is your character. And then Nicky Morgan, who was our Secretary of State for Education 3 back, she wrote her first book when she left office on character, her only book actually on character, called Taught Not Caught, talking about schools taking a much more explicit approach to character, and within the Department for Education she integrated quite a lot of kind of character-based activities, including awards, funding, etc. And a lot of that was actually picked up on by her successor Damien Hines as well, who contribute that as well. I'll say less about our current Secretary of State, although I do agree he's probably got quite a lot on his plate right now, and we're waiting to see what he'll say around character. But these are just kind of maybe green shoots of suggesting that actually the rhetoric of character, and actually all three of those are interesting. I mean, it would be, it's one of those kind of weird dinner, kind of fancy dinner parties that you might put together, having kind of Aristotle, Jurgen Klopp and Nicky Morgan all sharing dinner with you and having conversations about character. And I think if they were all having a conversation about character, they'd be coming from it from very different positions. But just what I want to highlight is kind of that rhetoric or that discourse, I suppose, around character is very much on the rise, I think, certainly in this country and in other places as well. If we could move to the next slide. This is a piece of research that I completed last year, because what we were interested in seeing whether teachers and parents are actually on the same page around character and attainment, and it's very hard to tell from the slides, but the headline findings was, and again we asked a kind of unfair question. I kind of think character and attainment are two sides of the same coin, as I've already said, but we asked a slightly unfair question. We said, you know, if you had to, this was to parents and then to teachers separately, fairly big samples, over 1,000 people samples, you know, if you had to prioritize character attainment, which one would you prioritize in your children if you had to? And teachers overwhelmingly said character, that's the second bar chart, and parents also overwhelmingly said if they had to prioritize one, they would prioritize character over attainment. And then we said, which one, what do you think the kind of the other person, the counterpart, would prioritize? And parents overwhelmingly felt that teachers were prioritizing attainment over character, and teachers felt that parents were overwhelmingly prioritizing attainment over character. So what we found basically there was a communication gap. So both felt that character was really important, but they actually felt the opposite to be true of their counterpart, and there seemed to be a communication gap going on in that sort of space, and that study is actually replicated in other countries as well, including the USA as well. So it feels that although we often think that character is important, we may be not communicating that, or it's just not being understood in these sorts of areas. And there are gaps in these sorts of places. If we could move to the next slide. So I think the big question is here. And as I say, I'm going to conclude in kind of in about 5 to 10 minutes and make sure we've got plenty of time for discussion and questions. But so if we think, given these positive signs, which you may or may not agree to, I'm really happy to kind of debate whether you think these are positive signs or perhaps something else going on. But if we think, given the positive signs of how character education might contribute more broadly to human flourishing, so how might it actually go about it? Where is the link between character education and human flourishing, and what sort of approach to character education might we actually need to prioritise to maximise the chances that both, as I say, individuals and society more broadly will thrive both currently and also in the future. And if we could go to the next slide, please. And I think, and there's this needs debating. This is, the research behind some of these areas that I'm going to talk about is not questionable, but I think is probably underdeveloped is a good word for it, and a lot of it for very good reasons, mainly because of the problematics of kind of measurements within this field of character education. But there's certainly theoretical and good solid theoretical underpinning to this, and also increasing amounts of empirical evidence that shows that character education can have a double benefit in these areas, that it contributes to what might be called individual flourishing, the contribution to happy, mentally, physically well, successful humans, but also as more a broader societal benefit, a focus on different types of virtues, including intellectual virtues, moral virtues, and particularly civic virtues, as well as what might be called kind of performance virtues, such as or performance qualities such as resilience, teamwork, leadership. These sorts of things can also have a more broader benefit for society, engaging morally and civically minded citizens. So I believe there is a double benefit both to ourselves and in society. And if we get the right focus on the right type of character education undertaken in the right approach or in the right way, then that balance between kind of ourselves thriving or flourishing and society flourishing can actually be managed very well. But that does depend on the right type of kind of character qualities being cultivated or honed, but also in a particular way. And I'm going to come on to that in my kind of last two slides where I can talk about this. So if we could move to the next slide. So my argument, and this is what I want to as I say, I'm going to do 2 slides on what I think we need in this kind of right way and in the right amount and the right sort of virtues. And I'm going to put up in a kind of 5 different ifs here, and then I'm hoping these ifs that I'm going to put up 2 on this slide and 3 on the next slide. I'm hoping these ifs can be the basis for, as I say, a discussion from your viewpoint. But my and based on the kind of Jubilee Centre's research, as well as many other kind of serious and well-known practitioners in this area and researchers in this area, argue that character education contributes to human flourishing if these conditions, and probably others as well, are met. So the first condition is that it gets people on board by centralising moral and intellectual, in particular phronesis, but it also includes civic and performance virtues. So what you'll find within the Jubilee Centre's framework, but also whenever I'm presenting work around character, is that we try to take a fairly inclusive understanding of character. Certainly in all of our work, we prioritise moral, intellectual, and in a large part civic virtues. We've got a new project on civic virtues right now. We think those are fundamentally important. You know, there's no point having things like resilience, teamwork, leadership, etc., if they're not applied to good ends. So those performance qualities that quite often take up a lot of the airtime when talking about character, including in kind of Nicky Morgan's book, probably the sorts of character qualities that Jürgen Klopp was alluding to in his quote. They are important, but actually they're only important if they contribute to strengthening moral and intellectual kind of virtues and convictions in applied spaces. But we think that by bringing all of these together, it enlarges the group of people who want to have a conversation around character and gives a better kind of approach to actually kind of starting to have more sophisticated conversations about the importance of character in these particular contexts. And I find, and I have to say, I find particularly phronesis, practical wisdom, you know, popularly defined as doing the right thing at the right time in the right place, the ability to balance up different virtues, to hit the sweet spot between kind of excess and deficiency of virtues, applied character, if you will, is actually a term, an idea, phronesis, practical wisdom, that I find a lot of teachers and practitioners really like, happy to kind of gather around and really, you know, understands and has that kind of face value sense in terms of their own life. So I think it contributes if we can find an understanding, a conception of character that gets different people around. If we could just go back to the last slide again. I've got it in front of me. So I think that's the first if, is we've got to find something that brings people together and doesn't divide people around our conception of character and virtue. I think the next one is about how it's presented and portrayed and kind of understood character. We think that you know, character education is about the prioritizing of particular intellectual virtues around autonomy, critical reasoning that contribute to autonomous action. It's not about fixing the kids, telling them how to behave, being overly moralizing, etc., taking what might be seen as a more indoctrinating approach to character education. The approach that we prioritize within the centre, within the different resources, materials, etc., that we develop, are very much about, for sure, children need scaffolding, they need good mentoring, they need support, but they also need to go out and experience the world and try out and make mistakes and learn from that mistakes and sharpen and hone their own autonomous and critical reasoning and thinking within those sorts of place. So the focus we see is not about, you know, telling the children how to behave or being overly moralizing this sort of sense, but focusing on kind of autonomous thought and action in that space. So that's the second if. It's about the approach. And then if we could go on to the next slide now, that'd be great. What I can get quite a lot of pushback sometimes from teachers and others is the, kind of the initiative fatigue. The teachers who are saying, well, this is just another kind of a new initiative, another new idea, or another a new thing that we have to do. The argument I try to make as much as possible that character education should not be viewed as another thing on the plate, but it actually becomes the plate itself. And the success that we have with teachers and schools is when you get a leadership team and then a distributed leadership team, including kind of parents, governors, the students themselves, who really understand that actually fundamentally a lot of what schools do can rest on a solid kind of understanding of character and values in that school space, that it's about the ethos and culture of the school, that good attainment, good behavior, good employability statistics, etc., all depend on having a core set of character qualities that everyone within that school community does it best, strives to actually show, not always achieving it, but strives. That's the way to go. And I think when you get teachers understanding that this isn't just another new idea, but it's kind of an age-old idea with a great history that actually fundamentally underpins everything that's going on, then that can also bring people on board. If it's not killed off by measurement, I think the temptation, and we can already see it in some places which are prioritising character, and this may be from individual schools who I've worked with, who got very into character education, but then brought a kind of whole load of metrics to try and measure every single child and what they're actually doing and in developing character, and over push the kind of the measurement of metrics, but also to some kind of dangers potentially within kind of countries and educational ministries trying to over push measurement on this space and actually try to always look at kind of impact around character education through perhaps approaches to measurement that are unwise. As I've already mentioned, measurement in this space is very difficult. It's particularly difficult for people who haven't got maybe a professional experience within kind of measurement in character space, and trying to measure incremental change in people's character, or even components of a particular virtue, is hugely complex and challenging. I understand this is a difficult argument to pull off, because it's very difficult to advocate for a particular approach in schools and say don't worry about the evidence about whether this is working or not working. I understand that's a difficult line, but I think there's lots that we can do in terms of intervention studies around particular interventions to see what sort of impact they may be having. I think there's lots we can do in a very formative nature in schools to help schools kind of put in things in place and look at how they actually have and to evaluate and self-reflect on their own practice in this sort of space. We can do more around kind of triangulation, mixed methods, other approaches to kind of get a sense of what's going on. But we've got to be very careful around if we think the character education agenda is important, that we don't actually kill it off through measurement. And then the final and perhaps the biggest question of them all, which I want to kind of hopefully be the one that we go into kind of discussion and debate and questioning on this topic, is if we can make the case that it can indeed be educated. And you've noticed I've probably used a variety of different words when I've been talking about educated, talking about honing qualities, cultivating these qualities, etc., etc. Rarely do I ever say teaching. I may have said it here, but rarely do I ever say kind of teaching character and virtue, because that doesn't, I think, tie in with the approach that we're looking for. It is about kind of looking at the strengths within individuals and seeing how they may be kind of help to kind of home and cultivate these. I think there's a lot that we can do in this space, through the Jubilee Centre particularly talks about kind of caught, taught and sought. What can we do to ensure that the environment helps children, whether it be the family environment or school environment or employment environment, makes it more likely that children, professionals, whoever it may be, prioritise character and virtue in their lives. In a court approach, we catch it through the environment, and what can we do is to ensure that leaders makes it more likely that it's caught. I think there's more we can do in the explicit sense around kind of mentoring, use of exemplars, use of kind of experiential learning techniques, use of reflective approaches. There's lots of different pedagogical approaches, others that I haven't mentioned, use of dilemmas, Socratic method, all these sorts of things that are perhaps more explicit and maybe more character taught. it's not teaching children to have a particular character quality, but it's teaching about character and providing experiences to children and others to kind of find out or develop or experience or debate, discuss, dialogue around kind of character scenarios they and others face, and kind of learn through those sorts of approaches, so in a more explicit approach. But ultimately we talk about kind of character sort, that the aim is really that children and young people are actually seeking out experiences and opportunities to develop their character, and the heart of practical wisdom is about taking a sort approach to it. It's about autonomous, rational, critical decision making in kind of particular situations, and seeking to show the right virtue at the right time and the right amount in those particular spaces. So there is, and I'm hoping this will lead to a good discussion, there is debates around all of those ifs, and particularly the last one about, how indeed might we educate character and character education. But hopefully that's a good jumping off point for us to start to either answer your questions, but hopefully hear your own contributions around what I have offered in the way of the presentation today. So thank you very much for listening to this, and I really look forward to hearing from you now.
Well, thank you, Tom, for a terrific talk and for your provocations. But before I open the floor, I'd like to pass the mic over to David Johnson for a few words. And then if you want to ask a question or make a remark, please can you raise your hand? And when I pass the mic over to you, can you also let Tom know where you're from and your name? Thank you. David.
Fiona, thanks. Tom, thank you very much. Wonderful talk, and really, opens up so many questions for debate and discussion, and very, very valuable, your own work and your thinking in this area. I'm kind of pleased you ended where you did with the word cultivation. And although I've made lots of notes when you spoke about cultivating rather than teaching, I sort of moved slightly outside of a UK context, although I'll talk about that too, into contexts, countries where an opportunity arose for a transformation and reconstruction of educational systems rather than an attempt, if you like, and I know your work isn't about adding on, it's not about an additive process, it's not about how can we add character. As you said, character is the plate. But just to focus for a moment on countries elsewhere that have attempted to transform their systems to put character first, or character at the center. And the first country actually that sprung to mind is Tanzania, just post-colonial Tanzania, where Julius Nyerere, himself a scholar of Mao, took on board the idea that, and this was really inspired by your pendulum, and that pendulum can actually, you're right in that it swings to, in the direction of character or in the direction of attainment. But those swings are very, very long, historically extremely long. So in the case of Chairman Mao, who who put education in the center to debate the contestation between what he called intellectualism and redness, the idea that there was a false separation between mental and manual labor. And by manual labor, Chairman Mao really spoke of the peasants who worked the fields, sowed and planted, and for him that was where real character lay. And for Julius Nyerere, when an opportunity came to transform an African educational system, that's what he put front and center, and said to kids, we'll teach you how to read and how to count, but what we'd like to teach you is how to sow and reap. and production, education with production, was put at the center. And for Julius Nyerere, this was an absolute vision for the development of character through education by transforming a system almost entirely. Now, that was actually, I mean, people might argue, well, and they do, and they're quite right in saying, ultimately, 10, 20, 30 years later, that was a failed experiment. We look towards Zimbabwe in the 1980s, when that shook off the shackles of the Smith regime and colonialism, and but not looking at Mao, but this time looking at Korea, basically the same, that character is developed and cultivated through worldview. So very much a socialist or a communist education system that was proposed in Zimbabwe to shift away from what they saw, the attainment, the individualistic culture of the West, private, individual, capital, and so on. So there was another example of an attempt when the time came to transform, root and branch an educational system rather than to attempt to add or insert. There are many other examples. Obviously, Latin America is full of such examples. South Africa was the recent southern hemisphere country that attempted to transform. So the question really is, when one comes back to the UK, I look at A.S. Neil's Summerhill School, a shining light of democratic education, and indeed also what many people might call a failed experiment in the face of rampant capitalism, in the face of rampant individualism, and so on. And I suppose really the two questions that come out of that, what then is the feasibility, of a project, not your project specifically, but a project in the broadest sense of the world, to attempt to cultivate or shift the way predominant thinking in educational systems. This is not to say that that we shouldn't think in that way or that it's unachievable, but I think it's very, very important to reflect rather than assume. And I'll sort of end my input here by a little debate I attended in one of these massively funded conferences, the Barkey Teacher Prize thing in Dubai, and huge amounts of money. So they actually set up a debating chamber. And the question in that debate was, is populism a result of the failure of the educational system? And the two speakers on either side was Julia Gillard, the American who just stepped down as Australian Prime Minister, and our own Michael Gove, arch conservative, hated by every school teacher you can imagine. But what was interesting is that actually, in the end, Gove won the debate. And many people believe that Gillard somehow had it wrong. That the assumptions were that through projects such as global citizenship or an understanding of values or character, etc., one could actually change fundamentally the structures, of educational systems, or really lay this as it was put then, at the feet of teachers who are doing really so many things to survive in cultures of autonomy and autocracy and so on. So really, for me, the question is perhaps where you ended. What then is the prospect of the cultivation of character in an education system, so that it deals with the root and branch and not become an additive bolt-on project.
Yeah. Can I respond briefly, Fiona, and then?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, just because I think you thank you so much, Dave, for that, David, and you sparked off all sorts of things going on in my head there. And I suppose it's the difference between revolution and evolution to some extent around this and what is the best approach. And although I think I was talking about to some extent, an evolutionary approach to get kind of schools and teachers to take this on. I think there's also a place for revolution, particularly in some schools, and some of the best schools I think that prioritise character education have started with a very much revolutionary approach. And new leaders come in and turn failing schools around in this takes time, and unfortunately senior leaders are not given time often in schools because they're too quickly judged on merits. So one of the best teachers I know who turned around schools, he said I needed 10 years and I need to have the confidence of people around me, but he turned it around to kind of an outstanding schools from one of the lowest ones by taking a very centered character approach and move that. If you move that up to kind of national positions, then that's interesting to look at. And I think Gove's a great example because I think he did try to bring about a kind of certainly kind of go further than others people have done in terms of not in the character area, but in terms of the other changes he brought in. I believe there's a good chance he won that debate just because, whatever you think of his politics, he is a very good politician, Gove, in many ways, in the way he speaks. And I could see that firsthand because he actually came and spoke and debated at the University of Birmingham through a Jubilee Centre event alongside one other former Minister, Secretary of State for Education from the Conservative, and then two Labour, and we had a debate from two Labour and two Conservatives. And Gove actually said during that time, he said that he always thought the character was important, but the reason he didn't put character in centre at that time is because he just really wanted to push the kind of the standards and the attainment and that sort of agenda. But he was reflective, and maybe he was trying to get his audience on side, but he was reflective enough to say that one of the biggest unintended consequences from that push around kind of core curriculum standards, those sorts of areas, he just didn't think that schools and teachers would kind of shift so quickly on that side of the pendulum to really narrowing the curriculum, to stopping kind of sports and arts and other classes to do extra maths and extra English classes because they were the ones that primarily counted when it came to the metrics. And he said that it was kind of an unintended consequence of that, and he regretted from that sorts of area. So I think there is maybe more politicians can do to bring wholesale change around this sorts of agenda, and perhaps the time is needed, and we've all had a jolt in the current time. But the key is, as I was saying, is taking people with you, and maybe some of those kind of experiments, those really fascinating experiments, inverted commas experiments you talked about in Africa. The key is to take people with you in that sort of space as well.
Well, there's a terrific amount of activity going on in the chat and lots of hands up. So I'm going to call first on Grace Yule, and then after that, Luke. Grace, you've been, putting some interesting comments into the chat. Do you want to have a few words?
Well, I'll just add in a moment, but in particular, I think in response to Nina Cullimore's question about this coming to some sort of consensus on what makes for good character in order to be able to educate for it, I would love to hear some reflection on that.
Yeah. This is a debate that could take up definitely the rest of the time that we've got here. So I'll just give some very brief comments on it because, what is character? When we come to the kind of what makes good character debate, I'm often reminded of what is character and character education. I'm often reminded of the Aesop's fable saying, which is something along the lines of the more that is said, then the more said than done, more is said than done. And quite often we end up kind of just talking about these things a lot of the time without actually getting on with action and practice in these sorts of spaces. But I do think it's very key that we do have an understanding about kind of what is character and what we think makes good character. But I think we've got to be very careful about doing this in any sorts of kind of top down way. And it's a fine balance. And I find this from just working with individual teachers teachers to whole schools to, you know, we've had a bit of a conversation about more national level. It's a fine balance between providing enough scaffolding to provide teachers with an understanding of what character is and what the different components of it and what the different types of virtues are, to having a top-down approach that says that all teachers or all schools must focus on, let's say, for example, resilience, gratitude, honesty. You know, I'm just picking them out from the hat here. But I do think needs to be a sense of agency from teachers, schools, to be able to understand or kind of choose or select the sorts of qualities that they think are most important for the children that they serve, you know, the communities that they serve. They know those communities better than most of us, and they know that, you know, where the focus should be. The other thing is, so many of these virtues, even if you come up with a list of 5 or 7 that you think are priority, there's so many of them are synonymous with other ones as well. You could just end up in a kind of a big matrix of them all coming together. So the sorts of things that we talk about with schools is trying to not get them to only just focus on what might be called performance virtues, just on the resilience, teamwork and grit, etc. stuff, but to include moral and intellectual virtues. And as I come back to, again, I think that focus on kind of practical wisdom as a meta virtue is something that binds the virtues together. That's something that's seen as virtue in action, in context specific action, is a really important quality that so many teachers find around, because it's not you know, it's not a top-down indoctrinating thing that saying that it's actually about wisdom in action on the ground in those sorts of spaces. And I think helping, and this is complex, I'm not saying this is easy, but, you know, helping children understand what might be, even in really challenging and difficult situations, the wiser action, character-based, virtue-based action in each situations is a great area that we can home in, and I think really does contribute to you know, kind of flourishing in many different ways, because we start to hopefully see people that prioritize you know, compassion, integrity, honesty, gratitude, humility, whatever it may be in those sorts of settings. I agree I'm being idealistic and hopeful in some ways, but I think that's where we need to be leaning towards, but not, you know, just telling schools or education systems saying these are the core virtues, but giving some autonomy within that.
That's a terrific question and response. Grace, do you have some more comments?
I just wanted a quick response. As I listen, I think another value of a more contextualized approach is that in the very discussion of what it is that we will consider to be a virtue, a character, in a sense, helps a community to decide what its values are. So, thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And just quickly on that, it needs to be, yeah, discussion. That's what makes bringing people together in this sorts of discursive way. So I would work with a school who wants to take a more character-based approach. Sorry, maybe losing me. Character-based approach, and start getting them to think about what the core virtues that they want to do, and just through that discussion we can get places.
Terrific. Luke, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Tom. It's really interesting. There's so many questions that I want to ask. But in answer to your question at the end about how we could educate, I wanted to present a couple of ideas and just see your thoughts based on the research and practice you've done. So I've developed an education programme, and it applies theoretical and practical components. The first part is improving literacy around well-being and around character and around flourishing, so that there is that kind of scaffolding that you mentioned. And then that's combined with enabling pupils to identify their own values, their own character traits or strengths, and also identifying what's meaningful in their life and developing their own sense of purpose. Once they've got this wider insight, we then look at applying that to practical real life solutions to improve their decision making. An example would be in their careers. So if they're deciding what directions to take, they can do these based on their character traits, or if they're deciding where to go in education or what they want from their relationships, they can do them based on their own personal traits, but also with this evidence-based work behind. So I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that and how that could potentially be developed or implemented.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, I just missed your name at the start because my internet connection just dropped out. Sorry, who asked the question?
Sorry, that's okay. I didn't give my name. My name's Luke. I'm an educator from Manchester.
Hi, Luke. Thank you very much indeed for that question and also that approach. And explaining what it sounds like you're doing some great work in schools. I'm just plugging in my phone right now. Yeah, I think I would say trying to, and quite a lot of the work that I've done, and actually a lot of the activities that I give for parents and teachers in the book are at decision making, because although ultimately, good character is seen in what we do, it's revealed in what we do, in the actions that we take. Actions are informed by the decisions that are, the rational, critical thinking that we have to do around different situations to decide what is the best course of action. And what so it sounds like what you're doing in terms of kind of trying to expose children to kind of dilemmas and situations where they're forced into making different decisions. Quite often, the best or the hardest decisions where, supposedly between two goods or two virtues is particularly key. Where I really find this is problematic is in the modern world of technology. My daughter's got a smartphone recently, which allows her to kind of communicate with almost anyone at any time, almost instantaneously at any place. And that just really squeezes out the potential time to really think through and make decisions and think through actions, because the expected spontaneous nature. Think about the apps they all use, Snapchat or Instagram, the senses that we've got to be doing things and thinking straight away. So if we can help children to slow down, to pause, to think through their decisions, to think through what is the best character-based approach, then I think that's incredibly important. And we use a lot of dilemmas in the classroom and in terms of kind of debate and discussion. We introduce them in different ways. I know people are even using kind of virtual reality to expose children to these situations, but other people through role play, through drama, through etc. So it sounds like that sort of approach sounds very promising, and I'd love to hear more about it. Please do contact me offline if you'd like to. I'd love to hear more about it.
Brilliant, thank you. I will.
I'm going to call on Mina. You've been very active in the chat. I just wondered whether you wanted to share any ideas or comments.
It's I mean, Christchurch University, Canterbury. It's great to hear. I did some work years ago in my role as head of department at the school with character education, kind of research, and it was really interesting. And it was great to hear what you were saying and your ideas. I suppose, having worked with a variety of the police, University of Kent, looking at issues to do with people who might be radicalized, the kind of the ideas about character and what's good may be very kind of quite relative. So, have you done any work with like Prevent, for instance, in the UK?
Yeah. I knew the questions were going to get hard, Amina. So thank you very much indeed for taking us into this new and clearly very important area. We haven't. The simple answer to the Prevent question was we haven't done anything in the Prevent space in particular. If you're at Canterbury Christchurch, you're probably part of the tradition there that the work of James Arthur is now obviously director of the centre, who was at Canterbury Christchurch beforehand, but indeed Andrew Peterson, etc. A lot of work around kind of citizenship education that's kind of morphed into the more character space, and we've done quite a lot of work seeing the linkages between character and citizenship education. But obviously citizenship education is, picks up kind of some of the agendas and issues related to the Prevent type work. So I don't want to say anything particular on the Prevent work because we haven't done much on it, and it's certainly not my specialism. I could say something more broadly about the nature, character and virtue, which I think might be interesting, and also I think they tie into what David was saying earlier, that I feel that there is a space, but untested largely, but well, not like untested, like tested, I think, day in, day out, just in our interactions, but perhaps not tested as empirically more research-based spaces. But I think there is a space around character and virtue providing a common dialogue for some of these more areas where there is relativism and kind of maybe a misunderstanding, or not misunderstanding, but kind of a conflict between different people or ideas or ideologies, etc. Because most of the approach I've taken has not been a faith-based approach. We've been talking mainly kind of about a virtue, the moral theory of virtue ethics, but if you look at kind of character and virtue from faith-based approaches, you'll find most of the main faiths will prioritize the virtues of kind of honesty, compassion, forgiveness, gratitude, etc. within there. Now, they may operationalize those in different sorts of ways, but at least you've got a language of character that might be helpful for starting conversations in more kind of problematic areas. But this is replicated in lots of different spaces. It's not just between kind of maybe between faiths or people of faith and non-faith. It's also replicated, in
Oh. Uh-oh.
Tom, we've lost you.
Come back.
been gone for.
No, it's all right. It's good. Seconds. It's fine.
It's fine.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think probably other people have been waiting a long time for it.
Now.
Thank you for answering my question. Thank you. We can hear you now. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Okay.
Pat, thank you.
Well, I'd like to pass the mic over to Jonathan Beale, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Tom, for an extremely interesting talk. Before I make this point, though, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you all right. I just want to say in response to the last answer, my very best bit of answer was no doubt the bit when you couldn't hear me. So just want to make that clear. But I can hear you, Jonathan, and good to see you.
Good to see you too, and thank you again for an extremely interesting talk. I wanted to ask you about your pendulum analogy, which I like very much, and how this relates to the assessment of character. So schools often shape their focus and priorities in terms of end results, and for at least some good reasons. For example, those affect students' future possibilities to some degree, and we want to shift the focus more towards character. To move the pendulum more that way. Now, one way to do that would be to make character part of what is assessed, and I think I share your views on the dangers and limits of this. It'd be terrifying to think that, for example, a student might be assessed before they go to university on certain character traits, let's say. But that's not, of course, the only way character can be measured. It can be measured through certain co-curricular activities or part of what is assessed as part of final assessments. Another approach to take it is your approach, and the approach of the Jubilee Centre more widely, is to shift our perception of what we value most in education more towards character. But I wonder how much that's possible when education's focused so much on end results which don't assess character, or at least don't generally do so. So my question to you is this. If we assessed character more and could show more how character development can be measured, doesn't that offer the most effective way to shift the pendulum in the way you want it to be shifted? If not, do you think that we need to fundamentally rethink the role of assessment in education and perhaps the forms it takes in order to shift the pendulum towards character?
Yeah. Great question, Jonathan. Do you know, I mean, I'm with you in some ways that, and this relates even to David's points he made earlier as well, but I'm hoping you can all hear me all right, but right now as well. But perhaps one of the quickest levers, if you wanted to change things, would be to bring in kind of some sort of assessment around this, and because teachers have just been trained to take assessment seriously, and we feel that we can measure it, and it would shift things, it would change the needle, I think, quite quickly. But I'm very reticent to suggest that until I can see a way that assessment can be done properly. Now, I think this thing, and actually relating to the discussion I was having with Mina a minute ago, I can see that there is some area. So, for example, citizenship education was assessed in this country, but primarily what was assessed was knowledge around citizenship. And I think there's lots we can do around assessing maybe knowledge of character, what might be called virtue literacy. You know, do children know and understand the virtues, etc. There is probably some measures we can bring in, and they're getting more tuned around kind of some of this reasoning approaches as well. You know, can children start to kind of understand, you know, their choices and the impact of those choices, and between their choices, I can see some assessment being able to be set around there. But ultimately, you know, what all these are leading to, all these different kind of components, if you want to call them that, of character, are, you know, the practice is what people do day in, day out in their lives. And there's so many challenges, valid challenges around situational challenges. You know, are we always the same person in different types of situations? How is character revealed over the duration of a lifetime, etc., etc.? That I just think make it very problematic to get any sort of reasonable measure of character in that sort of space. You're right, we're doing what we can to kind of shout about character and influence and advocate for character, and hopefully influence policymakers in that sort of space to change things, and that's having some sort of effect as well. But, you know, what else can we, you know, how else could a fundamental shift in this area take place? Well, I think there's some really exciting things happening. Some of the debates that School 21 and others inculcating, even, you know, Eton and others are involved with these as well, about, you know, how do we shift the conversations around assessment to assessing more what we value rather than just what we're able to actually assess are really interesting. And I think there's a rising tide of this. Where we'll end up, I don't know for sure, but I think just the fact that a lot of this is coming from grassroots, and schools themselves and school leaders are leading the way in this space, could be exciting times ahead.
Great, thank you very much.
I'd like to call on Thomas Godfrey Fawcett.
Hi, thanks. Fantastic discussion so far. I'm really enjoying it. Particularly keen on Jonathan's last question, and I suppose fortuitously this is following up a little bit on it. So you spoke at the beginning about the tyranny of metrics, and I think it also reflects a lot of the work by Hansen and Hacking and Ray and Williams' fantastic paper. And for me, a lot of that comes with the power that the person making the measurement has over the person being measured. And I think this was also reflected by what you're saying at the end about character taught and character sought, and essentially that kind of who the initiative is with and who is kind of making these decisions. I think character sought for me speaks much more to the kind of students being much more in control of what they want to learn. And so I was wondering, on the theme of assessment, if you'd thought about, or whether you had any thoughts on the role of self-assessment in this, because I think self-assessment as a way of thinking about assessment perhaps is a more kind of student-owned version of assessment. And I know that we have lots of issues within the education kind of field generally about validity and reliability of self-assessment, but I wonder about it as a possible tool that might be, on the one hand, able to redress some of these power issues that I think are the root cause of a lot of the issues that we have with assessment, and then also assess these slightly harder to operationalize and slightly harder to define ideas, particularly when you want one that is not necessarily going to be true for everyone. I think, speaking to some of Mina's points earlier, you know, that allows a lot more flexibility in terms of what actually is being assessed as well. Yeah, I would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. Yes, I've done quite a lot of thinking, and we've done quite a lot of thinking about self-reflection, self-assessment. In fact, the evaluation handbook that I led on with others in the centre actually has a whole section on self-assessment as a form of kind of character measurement. It starts with all the kind of the pitfalls and the things to watch out for in this space. But I think there's a lot you can do with self-assessment in this space. One of the reasons I'm particularly attracted to self-assessment around a character is that I think it is education in and on itself. I think any kind of assessment or evaluation procedure that not only kind of maybe gives you some sense of what's going on, but also is educational through the very process of it. And indeed, when I actually try and do any interventions and evaluations in schools, I try to use the measures as a form of education in themselves, as opposed to just kind of getting some extra data. I think anything that has an educational process is a really good way of ensuring that it's not just about kind of outcomes, but also about the process itself. So yeah, I'm very attracted to self-assessment in space. I'm also very attracted to kind of 360, if you want to use that term, types of assessment in this area, getting students to kind of comment on other students in kind of structured ways, getting assessments from parents and teachers. I'd love to see more parents and teachers reporting on this in kind of homeschool communications, rather than just sending home a kind of a report about how your child's doing in maths, English, science and all the rest of it. But actually having dialogue, building homeschool partnership around some of these areas and reflecting on those could be beneficial as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot more that we could know and do in this space. I think it's self-assessment, the key question is whether it's a more summative or more formative nature. I think we can definitely look at more summative approaches, but we've got to be very careful about how we construct a report and use those. Certainly as a formative approach, I think it's a very, very solid area that I've seen lots of schools do it very well, and I think more schools could use formative approaches around self-evaluation and character more in this area. So yeah, thank you for that, Thomas.
Great, thank you, Thomas. I'd like to call on Peter, who's got his hand raised. Peter? Hello? Well, there is a comment in the chat on our speaker from next week, Emily Chogue. Emily, are you available to ask your question to the group? I think maybe there's a connection problem. David, you have your hand raised. I pass the mic back to you.
Only if there aren't any more questions, I thought I would just raise one at the end, and it comes back to the assessment issue, really, because it does raise blood pressures quite a lot, and I just wonder if we have this conceptually right in a sense. I mean, do we? Does assessment have to be done, sort of in school or at the end of school? Does it have to become part of that kind of, metrics? So, I mean, there are 2 points here. One that I did actually want to make earlier. Certainly for diverse groups in this country and many other parts of Europe, then attainment is character. The young black boys in this country going to good schools know that they have to stand their ground simply by raising their hands to answer a question put to them by their teacher, because the chants around them from other black boys would be, "You're keen, you're a keener, you're not part of a culture, not part of this posse that has its allegiance to a different part of the world." So that kind of braveness and that kind of determination somehow to understand and succeed in school is character. So attainment is character. But to come to this assessment point, and again, I think there's so much we can learn, from other countries. And I don't want to sound like a socialist revolutionary, because that's what I was and maybe still am. But if we look at the barefoot doctors in Cuba, or the similar campaigns in Nicaragua, this was post-graduation from universities in which people who benefited from the educational system needed to display character and give back. So as trained doctors, they understood the problems of the rural areas. In Nicaragua, they ran massive campaigns on literacy, the kind of each one teach one campaigns. I've benefited from the education system, but I know that there are so many in my country, etc., who haven't had the opportunity. So it's my duty to teach others who haven't had this opportunity. Most recent examples still exist in Nigeria, sort of youth leagues or youth brigades, and certainly in Pakistan and India, the idea of each one teach one is absolutely a fundamental prerequisite for gaining a university place. So my argument is we don't actually have to assess in school and make it all the more complicated. Understand the purposes of school and understand what assessment does. Assessment in school has a selective function. Those who do well in what we used to call the 11 plus go on to grammar schools and so on and so forth, and those who do well in the A levels, get university places. And we know absolutely, no matter what it is we do, that schools, and often very good schools, do produce high attaining bigots, right? So these are sharp kids with 3 A stars, etc., no idea of the world around them, and they obtain a place at a prestigious Oxford college. So the point I'm making here is that any form of assessment, and we fail dismally on trying to assess the citizenship curriculum, any form of assessment pitched at that level at the end of school or within school, etc., there are kind of dangers to that, and that perhaps we should learn from other countries, the Nicaraguas, the Cubas, the Nigerias, Indias and Pakistans, in ensuring that any throughput from schooling comes with a demonstration of character. The each one, the teach one, the fact that in Rwanda, from the president downwards, everyone on the first Sunday of every month rolls up their sleeves. No cars are allowed on the road, and everyone goes into the neighbor's house or people who need help. They roll up their sleeves, they pick up litter from the road, they demonstrate character and demonstrate a sort of societal connectedness. And that's what we need. We don't need another qualification in character. We don't really need an assessment and so on. And to the matrices, as I said, these have a selective function, so it is to do with the throughput. But if the argument is that we should have some kind of assessment within school to understand character and how people understand the world, and I'm sorry that Emily isn't on the call because she would either confirm or deny it, but if we take the Kenyan curriculum, for example, or the South African curriculum, these are competency-based curricula. So we know that when kids learn ratio or proportion, 60s to 40 or 80s to 20 in their mathematics classroom, as part of a general cross-cutting competency, they are, in their social studies subjects, drawn to a discussion on poverty. And I asked the question about ratio. Is it fair that the wealthy have 60% of the facilities or the resources and the poorer have 20% or 40%? So kids in these countries with aspiring countries with good competency-based curricula do, in a sense, have an assessment that relates the academic attainment of ratio and proportion to a social studies and political discussion about poverty and inequality. But the point I want to end up with is what worries me slightly is the pendulum, and that we can't replace one with another. And we've had so many examples, people say, oh, what we need to do is go around the world and teach group work or teach people to, to cooperate and so on and so on. And we've done lots of studies in many different countries, but without, in a sense, an understanding of the knowledge of ratio or proportion, then actually trying to understand the world in a characterful way and a purposeful way is meaningless. So I don't think we can actually supplant one with another, that we have to find good ways of integrating them within a school curriculum, like the competency-based stuff that they're doing in aspiring countries in Africa. And if we really want a measure of character before young bigots go much further in the system, then put them to work in the way they do in Nigeria or have done in the Nicaraguas and Cubas and so on.
Yeah. So I can briefly respond in 1 minute, Phoenix. I know we're due to wrap up, but just briefly, David, I totally agree. I think character is revealed in what we do, and it's shown in what we do. This is why kind of any real measurement of character should involve an observation element to it. The best measures of character are longitudinal observations over time. This is why I think one of the problems with the metrics and assessment is almost because we've lost trust or faith in teachers, and therefore we have to try and manage them through bringing in more assessment and more metrics so that we can manage what they're doing, whereas we should be relying more on and trusting their professional judgment, because they understand the children in their classroom. A lot of them do, and we should trust that judgment, which is through observation, through watching children and giving more of that space. And let's face it, that's what's had to happen in this country in many ways. Children didn't have exams over the summer, and actually we still managed to give them grades, and I bet you some of those grades were based on how they actually saw and worked with children over a course time as much as their work that they've actually done. So I think it is revealed. We can use proxy measures. We could make a very good argument that character is the basis for good behaviour, and we can look at behaviour measurements. We can make a good argument that character is the basis for attainment, and use some attainment measures or kind of employability measures, etc. There's different proxy measures we can use in this. But the fundamental question that we've got to answer is assessment for what? And I think we've forgotten to go back to that question and ask, what are we actually assessing for in many ways? And that's where we really need to start conversations around. But I will leave it there because I can see we're just coming up to the end of the time. And yeah, hopefully I've contributed to the debate. I've really enjoyed spending time with you today. Thank you so much for all your conversations, questions, challenges, and discussion. And please do reach out to me if you want to check in on anything that I've talked about. I'd love to hear from you.
Well, there is just one final provocation from Jorg, about Aristotle.
Yeah,
I think we'll sneak that in before I close the seminar.
For Jorg, I will answer his question.
Thanks a lot. I'll try to keep it briefly. First of all, thank you for your excellent presentation. And of course, a special thank you for putting Jürgen Klopp next to Aristotle, which is important to me personally. So now for the serious question. I could imagine that some parents and the teaching staff you're meeting might ask the question why it's necessary and helpful to refer back to Aristotle and the concept of phronesis. What's your brief answer to this?
So why go back? Well, I mean, it's weird because, as I said, I'm going to publicise my book once more. In this book, I talk about phronesis all the time. It's a popular parenting book, and I'm going back to Aristotle to show how he can help us parent in today's digital world. The answer is because when I work with parents and when I work with teachers, they really they don't want to get into the kind of real Greek kind of Nicomachean ethics kind of ethical debate. But it's got that face value sense, I think, when we talk about that character is what happened. It's understood and realised that's such an important quality. So it just works, I think, because teachers, parents, children themselves understand that this quality is clearly important, and that it's not just about kind of blindly trying to get children to become more compassionate or honest or whatever it may be, although that's important. It's about how they are coming back to the previous point about how they are revealed or actioned in actual action, and it's that practical wisdom that really helps to explain that sense, you know, choosing. So for me, it works. Teachers, parents get it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, for a really terrific presentation, which, as you can see, has spawned a huge amount of discussion. If anybody wants to get hold of Tom, do email me and I will pass on his contact details, because there is an awful lot more in the chat, you know, around this topic. So thank you very much. And next week, we have the Templeton World Charity Foundation Visiting Fellow, Professor Emily Chogue from Moi University in Kenya, speaking. And the topic of her talk is Personhood and Society, the Making of a Kenyan Man and Woman, a Comparative Study. So thank you all for your, you know, attendance this evening, and the fantastic questions and the really interesting seminar, and look forward to seeing you again this time next week. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.